In exploring what is trauma, I'll like to look at it from a couple of different angles. The first thing is that it is a perceived or actual threat of identity, whatever it is that we identify with, of the survival of that identity. So we have a social identity, we have a financial identity, we have a mental identity, we have an emotional identity, we have a physical identity, we have a spiritual identity. When those identities are confronted with information, with a reality, with a possibility that threatens the survival of that identity, we may go into trauma. Now, shame is, of course, a very important part of that, and because shame threatens the social identity. Shame is the message that if this were known about me, I would be excluded, or it is known about me and I am excluded. I am excluded from the cool people. I am excluded from the church. I am excluded from the law. I am excluded from an important group of people. And it's interesting, in Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, we have survival is the first need. We have security of survival, the second need, and we have love and belonging is the third need. In a highly populated planet, where most of us are gaining our survival and security through other human beings, the love and belonging, if you do not have sanction, if you do not have acceptance, if you do not have belonging with the group of people who control the resources, you have a deep survival threat. And so shame is a trauma. It's a traumatic event. So if you do not have a mental identity, meaning if information or pain hits you at an intensity of shock that knocks you out where you can't think and make good decisions, in an independent cult such as our own, without a body that is confidently controlled, our survival is in jeopardy. If we're hit with an amount of pain emotionally and we can't function emotionally, we lose our ability to regulate emotions, to act proportional to this or that event because we're flooded. In that kind of scenario, then we may fail. With unregulated emotions, we may become socially ostracized without, for example, if we want to die, suicide becomes a threat. If we're enraged, being thrown in prison or being attacked by a gun or whatever becomes a threat. And so each of these threats links back to survival. The second thing that I want to reference is the hierarchy of the human brain. And this is a working model, meaning, I have no doubt that this can be improved upon significantly. But the brain stem, the oldest brain, is the reptilian brain. And it is sociopathic and has a fight, flight, freeze, instinctual divide. In any given moment, it just decides, am I going to freeze? Am I going to fight? Am I going to run? And so when we are in freeze, numbness, running constantly, trying to avoid certain parts of ourselves or other people, fighting, battling things, whether they're the right things to fight or not, we are in or functioning partly or fully from the reptilian brainstem. Above that, we have the limbic brain of just emotions that aren't, it's not sociopathic, it's emotional. But they're not very tempered with strategy, future think, etc., like that. And then you have the brain that thinks and pairs things and remembers things and puts things together. And you have the brain that puts things into the future, that imagines, and creates possibility in the future. And then you have the transcendent brain, the brain that is possible of having experiences that transcend the individual, that transcend the nationality, the culture, the species, and has these unified experiences of being one with the planet, one with the universe, one with the species, one with God, Goddess, all that is, one with something bigger than the self. And all of these are a hierarchy. And what this hierarchical structure means is it's kind of like snakes and ladders. If the survival of the individual is secure, then you go up into the limbic brain and start exploring feelings. If you are secure to have feelings, you're not in overwhelming amounts of pain and tragedy, etc. That's one of the reasons you're cut down into the reptilian brain, is if the pain and or emotions are so intense and overwhelming, you can't process them, so you just cut them off. If you can learn to have a good relationship with your emotions, you move up into more the thinking, strategic brain. If you're able to navigate and keep the body alive, you start dreaming about the future. And if you're creating a great future, you're keeping the body alive, you're having good social relationships, there's a natural tendency to be more transcendent, to think beyond the self, towards the group, towards the planet, towards the species, because the other parts are secure. The me is secure, but it's always, as soon as the me gets hit over the head with a baseball bat by a thug, you drop right down and go all the way back to square one, which is fight, flight, freeze. How do I keep this body alive? And what this suggests is that the sociopathic brain in the individual runs parallel to the sociopathic state of the cultural and physical environment. Meaning, if you are in a highly empathic culture, in a highly safe and responsive physical context, you do not hang out in the reptilian brain as a healthy human being. You're way up here dreaming about the future, anticipating, enjoying, co-creating in the present. What this means is that if you find yourself, if anyone finds themselves dropped and plunged down into a sociopathic, fight, flight, freeze, in this panicky energy, that one is in a sociopathic environment. One doesn't feel safe. One does not expect repair. One doesn't have adequate resources to turn to help. And one, in many cases, is actively afraid of an individual or group of individuals in the culture. One is afraid of the environment. Now, this is a very important thing to realize, because we like to pathologize and diagnose the individual while ignoring the environment that infects the individual. But it is actually intelligent, to some degree, for the reptilian brain to respond to reptiles. Now, what is a reptile? A reptile is someone who knows that the next door neighbor kid is being abused, but doesn't give a damn, because it's not affecting them. They're in a sociopathic state. They're behaving like a reptile. It's not me, I don't care. Go ahead, kill all the kids you want. I'm not doing anything. I'm focused on me. So when you have a highly sociopathic cult, when you are in danger, you don't think all I have to do is raise a hand and ask for help and lots of intelligent, supportive help will rush in. What you think is all I have to do is say that I'm weak and people will come in for the kill. Because that's how reptiles function. That's how crocodiles work. If someone's got a broken leg and another crocodile is hungry and they look around and see which crocodile can I eat, they say, oh, that one's got a broken leg. I've got better odds winning with them. And so the sociopath attacks the weak. The empath protects the weak. When you are in an empathic culture, even when you receive, a startling shock, it doesn't often go into trauma because you have absolute confidence that, you just shout and you've got friendly neighbors and this, and people come to your aid. And so the degree that we have people in traumatic states in our culture is to the degree that we have a culture that both induces traumatic states and fails to repair them. A sociopathic culture leads to a pairing with a sociopathic brain, the fight, flight, freeze brain, because the best way to survive in a sociopathic environment is with a sociopathic brain. And so this is another kind of aspect of the understanding of trauma. The next thing is the phenomena of flooding. This is information coming to you, presumably at a volume level that's comfortable for you. You've adjusted the volume. The light is not blinding you, but you can see it. So it's regulated energy at your discretion. You are not traumatized by the media aspect of this experience. Now, if the energy comes towards you in an unregulated way, and gradually, then in this flooded state, it becomes overwhelming. There's no perspective or scale. Because it's bigger. The energy, the perception is bigger than your senses and consciousness can digest. Now, at the point, you see, time, the sense of time is created by being able to focus first on this, then on this, then on this, and then on this. But how do you measure time when you're totally flooded, when you've lost all distinction? And that's the problem with the traumatic state, is you've lost all perspective. You've got a fear, a pain, a future so in your face in such an overwhelming way that you cannot see anything else other than the traumatic event. In this flooded state, there is no time, there is no space, there is no perspective. That is all that exists. In that timeless place, you have absolute terror because there's no protection. There's nothing else that you can put perspective on to say, I'm going to focus less on that and regulate my energy and more on this because it's in your face. And this is partly why it threatens the ego, because all the various parts of the self start being lost, and the identity becomes the event. And this actually can transfer one's primary sense of self from the one who watches the event to the event itself. It used to be the me watching it, but that was when there was the event, and then there's me. When you have a flooding experience that just completely covers you, not just the screen, but your whole sensory imagination, your mind, you lose distinction between you and the event, which means you are the event you're most terrified of. So there's no escape, and it's timeless. This is one of the moments when trauma can become PTSD, because it becomes this endless loop, and there's no way to repair or respond to a phenomena that's that big. So the sense of self has a sense of boundary, a sense of size. Energy has a sense of size, an event does. As an energy eclipses, like this is the hand, and the lenses on this camera are this big. There's plenty of energies that are much bigger than the self and the ego. And when one of those eclipses, and the sound screeches nonstop without distinction, and the visual screeches nonstop without distinction, you are in a naked hell. And the terror of that, the terror, once you've experienced that timeless terror, it can become the biggest dread to avoid, meaning you will do anything to avoid being swept into that place again. Now, it is that willingness to do anything, often die, that creates the framework for addiction, for compulsive behavior, and various things, to do something to keep my attention away from that flooded experience. This is also the nature of trauma. And this is why it is incredibly sociopathic to not have a circle of friends who gets that, who's trauma literate enough to understand this, and who will be there holding your hand in those moments you feel lost and consumed by the traumatic incident, holding your hand, massaging you so that you remember you have a body, singing to you so that you can interrupt the memory, doing EMDR so that you can interrupt the neuronal patterns, giving you care and reassurance. I am going to be here. You are going to make it through this. This is the way out of that hell and back into perspective. And a circle of 5 or so people can do that. One incredibly talented person can do that, but a circle of 5 or so people who dedicate themselves to the healing of that particular phenomena, of pure amateurs who have some basic sense of what they're doing, can do that. And that's the power of love. That's the power of friendship. And part of the weakening of a cult, part of the weakening of a culture, is that fewer and fewer Americans have a single friend that they could rely upon to do that. And the idea of being shuttled off, if you have health care, into a 15-minute doctor visit with someone who is in a profoundly sociopathic state and who is trauma illiterate and that can't spend the hours needed to talk you through, can be more jarring and more affirming of the sociopathic state of your culture than to just stay home and not reach out and not be rejected in that need. So this is the landscape of trauma. When it becomes PTSD, all the physiology responds and is not repaired. Repeatedly, one is re-triggered in a way that enters an elevated state. The chemicals of fight, flight, and freeze that are produced in the body to respond to what it can be a financial trauma. In a cult that will make you homeless on the street and treat you with shame as a bum if you can't make rent that month, you understand you are in a cult that values money more than human beings. Because if you valued human beings more than money, you don't throw people out on the street because they don't have money. If you value money more than human beings, then you throw people out on the street because they were $500 short on rent. Financial, and then once they're on the street, they immediately start losing 4 to 6 hours a day of their life. Their life expectancy is reduced by 4 to 6 hours a day. This is a daily murder. So finances, your finances are in jeopardy. And what's in jeopardy is not bits of paper. Because other people value those bits of paper more than they value your humanity, it's not the bits of paper that are in jeopardy, it's your good and safe, healthy, ethical treatment that is in safety. So there's this terror of the shame of being ostracized and cast out. Often we're bred as a cult to be highly sociopathic, highly chauvinistic in ways to look down and feel that, for example, people who don't have a lot of money are worth less, are worth very little, in fact. It's a poor person. Who cares about them? Well, if you believe that towards poor people and you have a financial crisis, you're vulnerable to become one of those people who has no value. And that is a terrifying prospect. And so it's not a healthy dynamic to value money more than people. So this is a real trauma. Now, when the trauma is produced, there is a desire to run, to flee, to freeze, to do something like that, and release the chemicals and gain perspective. Like if you run away or fight or freeze, you also have the possibility of gaining some perspective. But the dominance of the critical social brain that clamps down in a cult that doesn't understand trauma literacy, and so isn't going to understand if you run away or say, let's fight so I can get this energy out of my system, it's going to cart you off in jail and traumatize you again for picking a fight, or shame you and give you all kinds of feelings that you don't belong because you ran away or whatever, and maybe it was a social trauma, and so why did you run away, and all this stuff. When those chemicals don't get released in the body, the body doesn't get the message that the event is over. It's kind of like the accelerator was pushed on and the brakes pushed on, and the gas doesn't get to spend. It's constantly trying to be consumed and push the engine forward, but it's hitting these brakes. And that wears out the system and can add to additional trauma because now there's health consequences. Trauma moves into this domain of PTSD around such things as the heart not calming down beyond a certain point after a traumatic event. Now, a single person who holds your hand and connects and attunes and says you'll be safe could lower your heart, and it avoids the PTSD. But in a traumatically illiterate culture, you might have 5 people rush in and escalate your trauma by not attuning to you, and you realize they could harm your body, and they don't know that this bone is broken and all this stuff, and you're actually become more scared of the helpers than you did of the original event. So there's a variety of different ways that through sustained, unmitigated trauma, untended trauma, unintegrated trauma, misunderstood trauma, constantly re-triggered trauma, unexpressed chemicals in the body, that the trauma becomes PTSD, where the identity switches to being the identity of the one who is terrified and who can't feel safe and who doesn't have perspective, because in part, when you have a shaky, a weak identity, you're not very clear in your thoughts, you don't really know who you are, you don't really have a clear plan. When you're traumatized, you're thrust into the unknown and you grasp desperately for something solid to protect you. And when the most solid and strong event is the actual event itself, is the terror, one can identify and say, I am the terror, I am this one who is not safe. Now, as soon as you identify and say, I am the terror, I am the loneliness, I am the one who will never have friends, I am the one who cannot keep a job down and may be broke on the street, that's who I am. That keeps producing an endless stream of anticipated desperate chemicals in the body trying to escape that. But when you believe that's who you are and you cling to it for a sense of stability, for a sense of identity, now you're in a domain where you can't necessarily feel a sense of you can't release the constant chemical process because you're so scared by the trauma you need to cling to something solid. But the most solid thing in your life is the wound, is the event. So you keep reliving the event to hold on to something solid, to stay in, because you're afraid of the unknown, you're afraid of the future, you're afraid of yourself. You hold on to something solid, but it keeps producing the event. So those are some of the mechanisms, or the other way that it can, move into PTSD is, for example, you're abused, you reach out to ask for help, and you are abused for asking for help. Then you talk about that, and no one believes you. And you get the clear message that the biggest threat to your own survival is your efforts to survive. When you are in a profoundly ignorant and sociopathic culture, the more you do to increase your safety and ask for help, the more damaged you become by the abusers around you, who join ranks to attack the victim rather than protect the victim. And this is particularly likely in relationships where there's a big power differential. For example, with my therapist, the therapists who had recommended him all joined ranks to protect the therapist and to keep the abuse secret. So when multiple therapists are ganging up on you in a regressed state, and the abuses that you're referencing and being triggered back into are the childhood abuses when multiple parents and grown-ups ganged up to keep secret and hide the abuse. Then there's a continual pattern throughout life of superior mass and force ganging up to attack and punish the victim and the abuse survivor to protect the power structure. And then when you have incidences of your own government doing the same thing, at the same time, you start to feel that your efforts to protect and be healthy are hurting you more than just collapsing and dying. And this creates a paralysis where there's very high fear-produced chemicals because you're in a terrifying environment, but there's no way to act and respond, so it creates paralysis and powerlessness. This is also creating PTSD. PTSD is created, in short, when you have a sociopathic culture and environment that divides the self in a state of trauma to not knowing whether you're going to be hurt more by trying to protect yourself or hurt more trying to enable your abuser to abuse you some more, and you have no clear hope and time frame on the horizon, and you're flooded in this timeless place, and you just get lost in this loop, which becomes so frightening that you become afraid of yourself, afraid of the full freedom of consciousness, because it might sweep into that zone again where that horrifying terrain is happening. And this is among the most cruel things that we do to ourselves by doing it to others in a culturally, in a traumatically illiterate culture. And this circle, this kind of journey for thousands of hours of my life is my strong sense that responding to this is more important than money. That if we're to be human beings and consider ourselves human beings, we have to prioritize the human beings that we have induced into this state and do everything that we can to take them out of a reality that is in many ways worse than death.